Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. It's time again for a question and answer segment, and I've got questions from you, the viewers. And today we've got one from Treason over on Patreon who asks, the Organization of American States wants to probe genocide in Canada after the release of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls report. What happens if the panel finds Canada has committed such abuses? Okay, difficult question. I think first of all, we need to remember that one of the conditions for a genocide finding is intent. I think that's where this whole thing is going to end up hinging. The inquiry, found instances that match the five preconditions for genocide finding within their report and managed to come up with a legal justification for it. I think where they're going to have difficulty in any kind of international context is around the intent to commit genocide. I think that's where you're going to be hard pressed to find any kind of specific intent on the part of any government. The complicating factor there, of course, is the kind of historical instances of cultural genocide that was around the institution of residential schools and so on. But I don't know that it's going to necessarily be able to find a through line directly to any kind of findings around killings or anything like that. I think that in the instance where if the OAS were to have a finding that there was genocide perpetrated, what I think is going to be interesting to kind of see where that goes next is in terms of any kind of court process that would need to happen in Canada. Unless we got the International Criminal Court involved, I don't know that there's any particular appetite for that, particularly because there isn't any real kind of mastermind behind this. And that's partially why I think it's this particular finding is going to be difficult to sustain in any kind of international investigation. There hasn't been, unless we want to start putting historical figures on trial, which gets very complicated, and I don't know that any good can come of that. I think the scope of this is going to largely be limited, except for reputationally. I think that is where this kind of starts to hinge. What I mean by reputationally is, on the one hand, we have countries who will constantly say to Canada, well, what about your own record? And, we can point to saying, yes, we're addressing our own record now. On the other hand, I think that if there are any particular positions where Canada needs to assert some moral authority with any kind of dictators or situations like that, I think what this ends up doing is limiting our ability to have some of that moral suasion. Of course, international affairs isn't my real forte, but this is kind of how I read the situation. So I think it'll be interesting to see if any of this plays out. But again, like I said, I think where this will hinge on any kind of OAS panel or anything is going to be around intent. Our next question comes from Stephanie, also on Patreon, and she asks, there's been a lot of discussion about the UK versus Canada Parliament and which has a healthier culture. What is your opinion of this? And I have them. Should Canada have more MPs to bolster the legislature versus the executive? Short answer is yes, and long answer is it's a combination of factors than just the number of MPs, but this is something that I do talk about in my book. And part of it stems from the leadership cultures in Canada versus the UK. Some of you may recall that I talk a lot about how the leadership system in Canada is terribly broken and has resulted in a lot of centralized power that doesn't necessarily happen in the UK in the same way. In Canada, because since 1919, we've developed a system where party leaders are chosen by members of a party, as in people who go out and buy memberships and not sitting MPs. It's developed a culture where a leader chosen through this process says, I have the democratic legitimacy to be the leader. You, the MPs who are elected, must respect that, and therefore you can hold me to account. In the UK, the caucus would still be able to hold their leaders to account because they still chose their leaders until just very recently when they changed their systems to be much more Canadian-like. In the UK system, there is at least that safeguard that at least the leadership candidates must have to at least be MPs, whereas in Canada we get a lot of people who aren't currently sitting MPs running for leadership positions trying to put their own stamp on the party like that, which is incredibly destructive to the party system in our country. The UK hasn't had that particular dynamic, but in the Labour Party in particular, this new system allowed for a bunch of a group of activists to take out memberships, get Jeremy Corbyn elected, and then when he agreed to a leadership review, because he's been so completely disastrous for the party, they still were able to keep him in power because they had this activist core who bought memberships and who voted. We're seeing that play out right now with Theresa May in the fact that she has stepped down as party leader, but is still staying on as prime minister. We can get to that in a minute, but it's because normally another MP would be chosen from the caucus and would assume the position of prime minister right away. Now they're having a months-long process where a number of MPs are putting their name forward, and there's going to be a process of elimination and then final selection from the party membership. All of this to say is that that system in Canada created a lot more centralizing power for the leader's office, whereas it didn't have that same centralizing power in the UK. You had a lot more ability for backbenchers to hold their leaders to account, and that helped to create more of a balance in terms of where the executive is able to exert pressure on the legislature and where the legislature is able to push back to the executive. Because you have your backbenchers who can say, if you overplay your hand, if you overexert your authority, we can remove you. That can't happen in Canada, not really as easily, not unless you have a mass resignation or walkout of your backbench. So that's part of where that dynamic has shifted in the UK versus Canada. The notion that the UK has more MPs and therefore is able to have a bit more pushback is valid, partially because there are more safe seats among the larger backbench, and also because there are fewer chances for people to get made into cabinet ministers, and therefore they, if they aren't going to be a cabinet minister and they've got a safe seat, it's easier for them to become a little more independent, to push back a little more, because they've got that bit of insulation. And that's something that, again, we don't really have in Canada because we don't have enough MPs, we don't have enough safe seats, and we have high turnover among our MPs. There's a higher incumbency rate in the UK. There's also a culture there where you have a former minister who will stay on as a backbencher and become a subject matter expert. In Canada, once you're no longer a minister, most of the time you will end up leaving politics and translating that into some kind of private sector career afterward. We have a few examples currently where we had short-term ministers who are still sitting as backbenchers. They will often become committee chairs or so on, but there's not enough of that in Canada to form a kind of healthy legislative culture that exists in the UK. Canada could easily accommodate a lot more MPs than we currently do. There's a lot of disparities right now in the levels of representation by population across the country. Because PEI has 4 seats for a very small population, and the territories especially, vast distances, very small populations, 1 MP per territory. Whereas Ontario is vastly underrepresented in terms of the size of ridings, in terms of how many people they represent per MP. So if we got another 100 MPs, for example, distributed them a little more so that Ontario was finally a little better represented, we might start to change some of those dynamics. We might get a few more safe backbenchers. We might get a few more, places where people on the backbench say, I'm not one screw up away from a cabinet post, therefore I can start exerting a little more independence. That might develop over a little more time, but it can happen also without some of the other dynamics changing, particularly around the leadership and the centralizing power there that comes from the way in which we choose those leaders. So again, it is part of the equation, but it's not the whole equation. The other thing I was going to get back to in this was the notion around Theresa May still being Prime Minister while no longer being party leader. Recall that in our system, MPs are individuals. And in this particular case, she's adopted what is generally known as a caretaker mode for what's going to happen with the government over the next couple of months. So she's still Prime Minister because the Queen always needs to have an advisor. But because she's put herself into a caretaker mode, that means that there's not going to be any particular controversial legislation or anything put forward. It's just going to be ensuring that there's a day-to-day process for government to still happen, and they still need someone in that position to make that happen because the Queen needs advice for signing orders in council and so on and so on. So that's machinery of government. She retains that role until the party can choose a new leader who will then become the Prime Minister. It's a bit interesting, and it's a bit kind of almost silly because of the fact that they've put in this ridiculous leadership process that is just going to make things worse if the Canadian example is any guide. But that's kind of what happened there. We in Canada have had positions or points in time where we had a senator who was the party leader and Prime Minister, and so therefore they weren't in the House of Commons for any of their duties. This hasn't happened since the late 1800s, so calm your jets, but it is something that can happen in our system, and that's kind of the nature of the way in which our system can operate. So there is some flexibility there. And it makes for interesting and exciting times for people like me. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale. That's Journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.